They wouldn't put all their eggs in the American basket, but they haven't really shifted that much.
Speaking of that, there was the Beijing Agreement. I think this was on December 9th, where Saudi Arabia, China, and Iran were in additional negotiations. What is this about? I mean, because obviously there's a complication here with Saudi Arabia's, let's say, relationship with the United States, but Saudi Arabia is also, I guess, trying to make a relationship with Iran, with China as an intermediary between these countries.
It's not really a big deal. I think I haven't been following it, but I think that these negotiations were held in Tehran, and they are a continuation of the negotiations and the agreement that happened in China, in Beijing, where Iran and Saudi Arabia reestablished ties. Iran is trying to improve ties with Saudi Arabia, and the Saudis, to a point, can. But at the end of the day, as I said, a NATO country like Turkey, countries in the Persian Gulf which are bound to the United States, they can only go so far in standing against U.S. policy, and thus their relations with Iran can only improve so much. It's just like with regards to the Israeli regime, none of these countries broke off diplomatic ties. Those that had diplomatic ties, none of these countries broke off economic ties, direct or indirect. The imports, exports, exports to Egypt, or imports from Turkey, or from Baku through Turkey, all of these continued. So these countries are still bound to the United States. So that's why I think that it's even though they are concerned and they feel that the Israeli regime is the threat, the real threat, something which their populations have always believed, by the way. When these governments across the region constantly said Iran is the threat, is the major threat to our existence, in polls that would be regularly carried out by Western institutions in these countries in the Persian Gulf region and beyond, the people on the street said, no, Israel is the primary threat. And so now these governments are saying what their populations have always been saying. So, this does bring about some change, but how much change? It's, at the end of the day, after the airstrikes, the first thing that the Qatari leaders did was to fly to Washington.
Yeah. One of the other things that's taking place in the Middle East has to do with Lebanon. There seems to be a huge amount of pressure being applied to Lebanon to try to, quote, demilitarize Hamas, effectively to take away Hezbollah's weapons. Well, they're trying to do the same thing in Gaza also, but just for the sake of Lebanon. Yeah, they're trying to effectively take away Hezbollah's weapons. This is massively unpopular, even among people who are not necessarily super supportive of Hezbollah in this case. And, there's also people in the region are worried about attacks from basically jihadists coming out of Syria, for example. Basically, Lebanon feels surrounded. Give me your take on this. I mean, do you think this is a real danger in this case? Is this something that you believe is going to take place?
Yeah, well, that was the objective of the dirty war in Syria in 2011. That was what the plan all along. And so those people who were supporting this so-called blessed revolution in Syria, they knew that they were in bed with the CIA and Mossad and all the intelligence agencies of these, as you would call it, puppet regimes. And this is one of the extraordinary things about some so-called pro-Palestinians who are also supporting the dirty war in Syria, because they were working in parallel with the major powers, the NATO and Israel, whose project was to undermine the resistance. And getting in bed with the CIA and NATO and for a decade and a half to destroy a country is not going to lead to good results. And we were saying all along that if the likes of Jolani come to power, they will be they will be working with the CIA. Lo and behold, we see him in his love fest with Petraeus. He will be in bed with CENTCOM. He plays basketball with it. He will, but he went into the White House and Trump sprayed him with Trumpian perfume. And just recently, CENTCOM, thanked them for blocking weapons from getting to Hezbollah. So that was the plan all along. That's why they brought down Syria. For Iran, and this offends and I've been saying this for many years, and this offends some of those who were supporting the previous Syrian government. For Iran, the previous Syrian government was by no means ideal, and Iran's support for it was not even 1/100% for sectarian reasons. And those people who opposed the resistance always knew that. They always knew that. They knew that Iran was supporting Syria because Syria was facilitating Iran's support for the resistance, both in Palestine and in Lebanon. And that's why the United States and the Israeli regime targeted Syria. And Iran knew that if the Americans succeeded in overthrowing the Syrian government, what would come to power would be worse.
Yeah.
Nothing good would come out of it. And that's exactly what happened. And Iran, knew that Erdogan was supporting ISIS and Al-Qaeda and these intelligence agencies that are countries that are puppets of the United States, that they were funding this. You know that Serena Sheem, for example, she was reporting from the border between Turkey and Syria how ISIS was being brought into Syria and how weapons were being brought into Syria through World Food Organization trucks. And then she was murdered. The Turkish intelligence said that she was carrying out espionage. She went on live TV, press TV, to say, that's what they're saying. I'm not doing espionage. I'm just a reporter. And then she was killed hours later. I mean, no one believes that it was an accident. So that was the story. So right now, what is happening is that after the fall of Syria, the regime, the ISIS and Al-Qaeda regime bound to the West, they are putting pressure on Lebanon. The prime minister of Lebanon, installed by the West, is putting pressure on the resistance, and so is the Israeli regime. So Hezbollah is sort of surrounded by this alliance of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Zionism and the liberal pro-Western leaders in Lebanon. That is, crude way of putting it, I guess.
Is Iran still able to help the resistance given the fall of Syria?
Oh, yes, without a doubt. Iran will continue to support the axis of resistance. Hezbollah is prepared for war if the Israeli regime pushes the region in that direction. And Iran will continue to support Hamas in Gaza. Someone sent me a clip of someone saying that Iran is not supporting Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad. I mean, let's be clear. There's no way that, despite the heroic defense of Gaza, that the people who are completely surrounded would be able to stand for over 2 years without some sort of, things getting in through tunnels and through, other means. So Iran has been doing that. Iran has been supporting all of the resistance groups, and of course Yemen and so on. So yes, Iran continues to do that.
There was an article that came out in Tassim News today, and I'm trying to get the general's name. So this was an Iranian spokesman for Iran armed forces, and he pointed out, he said Iran is stronger today than it was in the 12-day war. That basically the 12-day war strengthened Iran. It didn't weaken Iran in the way that some in the West may anticipate. Is that true?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct, because Iran now knows the capabilities of the Israeli regime. It knows what its own shortcomings are. It knows what its strengths are. The Israeli regime gave it its best shot because it was a regime change operation. So they used everything, all of it, their capabilities. And the Iranians discovered its own, their own weaknesses, their strengths, the strengths and weaknesses of the Israeli regime.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, remember, during the last few days of the war, the Iranians were hitting the Israelis harder and harder, yet they were using less and less missiles.
Yes.
Why was that the case? Because they knew how to get through. And the Israelis and the Americans, it was basically the Americans were doing the heavy duty work. They were the ones who were, the real air defenses were the American air defenses, not the Israeli defenses. Without the Americans, the Israelis would have not been able to do anything.
Mm-hmm.
But after a few days, the Iranians discovered what sort of weaknesses they had. They exploited them. And the Iranians began to deal with their own air defenses, their own internal, the weaknesses. So yes, if a war breaks out, or if the Israeli regime again carries out a blitzkrieg attack on Iran today, the armed forces and the government and the state, they're much more prepared than they were back then.
I'm curious also, what is the relationship between Iran and the current Syrian government? I mean, there are a lot of people in the Middle East who take issue with, let me explain it this way. Because I cover all sorts of different parts of the globe, oftentimes different parts of the globe have a different point of view on other parts of the globe, which creates friction on my channel sometimes. There is a point of view that Russia and China should have done more in the context of the Middle East. And especially along this way of, let's say, not breaking off diplomatic ties with Israel. And a lot of people take issue with Russia's relationship with the current Syrian government that's in play now. What is your take on that? I mean, and this question is somewhat awkward and inelegantly put, but I hope you get the spirit of the question. What is the relationship between Syria and Iran currently? And does Iran take issue with Russia's relationship with this government?
Well, I'm sure that the Iranians are not thrilled by by Russian policy towards Syria, but the Iranians at the moment, they have refused to engage with the government in Damascus. The government in Damascus has sent messages through different means to Iran, including the Russians.
Yeah.
But the Iranians still are not interested in any form of engagement until the Syrian, the government in Damascus behaves in an altogether different manner.